people get it in their head that if there is no afterlife, then when they die, they will experience nothingness forever. And they don't know what that means. Right. And it's because it's nonsense. You won't be experiencing anything. There will be no you to experience.
No one can say exactly why so many people conclude that to not exist is to be in a state of nothingness, an unending silent black void, peaceful oblivion. Many of them recognize that such an endless peace or silence or darkness is incompatible with the idea of not existing. Yet the mind grasps and settles to offer us a vision of darkness, a black empty void. Here's Alan Watts on this.
If we think of death as endless darkness, endless nothingness is not only inconceivable, but it's logically absolutely meaningless.
In 1994, Tom W. Clark, a naturalistic philosopher, wrote his essay, Death, Nothingness, and Subjectivity, where he introduced the idea of generic subjective continuity. Generic subjective continuity explains why death will not be followed by nothingness. And so, instead of anticipating nothing after death, we should instead anticipate something or somethingness after death, just as non-existence before birth was followed by something.
This is a secular perspective on death, obviously naturalistic. And then I think there's a secular mistake, which I'm sure none of you ever make. People always deny making this mistake, but there is a secular mistake about death, which is to expect oblivion or nothingness at death. And I want to correct that mistake, as we'll see, but I want to expand on his correction and make it vivid by conducting a thought experiment. Don't anticipate nothingness if that's your intuition. Anticipate somethingness. And your personality and conscious sense of self depend on the brain. This is what a naturalist would say. This is what the science-based view of ourselves says, is that consciousness is based in the brain. There's nothing immaterial that's needed to account for consciousness. But, so there's no soul necessary, I should say. There's no immaterial you, according to a naturalistic worldview. You're fully physical. So somehow consciousness, the sensory sensation of being a self, having experiences, and all experiences come out of what the brain does. That's what the evidence shows. But we don't know how it's done, which is why it's called a hard problem. There is no, and I look at this pretty carefully, as far as I can see, there's no received, accepted explanation of consciousness out there in the scientific or philosophical community. There are lots of hypotheses and lots written about it. You never catch yourself missing. You're always there catching yourself as a conscious subject. So this is a very curious fact about consciousness, because objectively, I took a nap earlier today, conked out in the library, very comfortable chair, nice. I had no experience of that nap. All I had was the experience before I went to sleep, if indeed I think I slept, and then waking up. There was no subjective absence of myself that I experienced, right? So think about this. Every minute of your life that you've been conscious is a continuous stretch of consciousness. You're never absent as a conscious subject. Scientific, empirical standpoint, there's nothing about you that survives. Why? Because when your brain dissolves, as it will, unless it's somehow reconstituted, and that we'll get into later, all the functions that support consciousness end. So your consciousness ends too, right? I hope this is not too controversial, especially if you're a secularist. If you're not, you're going to believe, you might believe in the soul that leaves the body at death and goes somewhere else. But I'm taking the naturalistic standpoint for granted here, because I have to operate from some premises, and that's the premise we'll operate on here. Don't suppose that I'm positing something that's going to survive death that is recognizably you. That's not what I'm going to be talking about. So that's the naturalistic view of death. There's no evidence of anything non-physical that continues after death. There's no woo here, nothing spooky or supernatural. What should we expect at death if we're naturalists? If we stick with science and evidence as how we know about things? What should we anticipate? And what I want to say is that secularists sometimes make a mistake. They expect oblivion at death. Now, I'll give you some quotes. There are actually many quotes in the paper, which is called Death, Nothingness, and Subjectivity. That first third of the paper is really to establish this point that people, in fact, suppose that when they die, they're going to fall into something they call either nothingness or oblivion or darkness. So here's some examples. Here's Philip Larkin, a poet, wonderful poem called Obad. And I'll read this because it so beautifully expresses what I think the secular mistake about death is. He says, death, total emptiness forever, the sure extinction that we travel to and shall be lost in always. This is what we fear. No sight, no sound, no touch or taste or smell, nothing to think with, nothing to love or link with, the anesthetic from which none come round. Pretty compelling, dramatic expression of the idea of going into a place that you can't get out of forever. The sure extinction that we travel to and shall be lost in always. Okay, so that's Philip Larkin. Here's Anthony Burgess, author of A Clockwork Orange. He's a novelist, and he wrote about death, and he wrote as follows. And notice all the allusions to darkness and emptiness and nothingness here. He says, if there is only darkness after death, then that darkness is the ultimate reality. In the face of approaching blackness, which Winston Churchill facetiously termed black velvet, concerning oneself with a world that is soon to fade out like a television image in a power cut seems like mere frivolity. So that's Anthony Burgess. And notice the references: darkness, darkness, approaching blackness, black velvet, fade out. All of this suggests that at death he thinks he's going to go to a place of permanent darkness. Nothingness. Here's more. Isaac Asimov, good old Isaac. When I die, I won't go to heaven or hell. There will just be nothingness. Here's, in a nutshell, what the mistake. I'm sure we could easily argue Isaac out of this mistake, and it might be a sort of casual expression, but I think some people are actually worried about this. Probably not you, but some people are. And here is the quote that starts the article that this talk is based on. For only death annihilates all sense, all becoming, to replace them with non-sense and absolute sensation. Non-sense, the absence of sensation. And here's Arthur W. Frank, who had a heart attack, and he said about his heart attack, I will never lose that imminence of nothingness, the certainty of mortality. Nothingness again, awaiting us as we approach death. And finally, Larry Josephs was an AIDS patient. He says, I hope that when the time comes to face death, I will feel stronger and less afraid of falling into an empty, black abyss. So here are at least some examples of what I think is, some people may expect. When they die, they have this sense of impending, what? Being plunged into a permanent extinction, into nothingness. Here's the case against oblivion. What is it? It's to anticipate nothingness or oblivion is to project yourself into a situation after death. What is that? It's to suppose that we'll undergo non-experience and therefore inhabit nothingness. So it's really like to experience an absence of experience. And what would that be? Well, it would be blackness or an abyss or darkness or emptiness or nothingness. Now, Epicurus, a philosopher who lived before the Christian era, I don't know his exact dates, was correcting this mistake. And this quote from Epicurus is pretty widely spread. He said, when I am, death is not, and when death is, I am not. So here is the correction of all those previous worries. When death comes, you're not there to experience it. You're not going to be around to experience the lack of experience or nothingness, you're not going to fall into an empty black abyss to reside there forever. You're not going to be there. So death is not a state into which you go. So the fact that Epicurus said this suggests to me that, in fact, the secular mistake about death is an intuition people actually have. Because this quote has survived the centuries, and it's brought up again and again to counter the intuition that some of us have, that we're, at death, we're going to be plunged into nothingness. And Epicurus says, no, you're not going to be there, so death is not going to be a fact for you. Well, if that's true, that if death won't be an experienced fact for us, we don't undergo the end of experience. We don't experience the end of experience. All right? So this is sort of, I hope, a fairly straightforward case against oblivion or nothingness. But we're still left with the question, all right, if we're not going to be plunged into nothingness or blackness, what should we anticipate at death? And again, my answer will be not nothingness, somethingness. I want to conduct a thought experiment, which is basically the second 2/3 of the article that's online. A thought experiment which is designed to make it vivid that when you die, it's not going to be the end of experience. Now, the baseline for this thought experiment is just your everyday life. What do we notice? I mentioned this before. You never find yourself absent from the scene as a subjective, conscious being. Objectively, you lose consciousness regularly, right? You go to sleep, you might get knocked out, have a surgery, put on with an anesthetic, but those are never experienced moments for you. So you're always present before and after, and there's no subjective gap that separates them. It's an instantaneous transition from one experience to the next. So here we go. Despite the fact that we are frequently and regularly unconscious, these unconscious periods do not represent subjective pauses between periods of consciousness. That's a quote from the paper because it says very carefully what I'm trying to say. And here's another quote. For the subject, there's an instantaneous transition from the experience preceding the unconscious interval to the experience immediately following.
Here's a part from Clarke's thought experiment from his essay where a futuristic surgery is performed which radically changes him to the point that Tom Clarke no longer exists.
A greater change in our spectrum of transformation cases. I want you to imagine that greater changes are induced so that a person who wakes up from these modifications that have been made is no longer you. It could be someone that we're not sure about, or it could be someone who's recognizably definitely not you. So what can we say about this? Well, we can say that there's no more personal subjective continuity. Why? Because you aren't there anymore. A new person now exists. Why? Because the neurosurgeons have made enough changes in the brain, shall we say, and this is a thought experiment. It doesn't matter whether we can do it now or not, right? Philosophers often use thought experiments where, of course, we don't have the technical capacity to precisely change personality, but it's conceivable that at some point we could. So go along with this and think of yourself being put to sleep. You wake up later, and it could be days later, and you could be moved to another town in the process. And when you wake up, the person that wakes up is recognizably not you. The memories have changed, the personality has changed. So there's no more personal subjective continuity because you're not there anymore. A new person, because of this transformation, a new person is there. But here's what I want to claim, and here's the crux. This is the hinge of the argument. There has been no subjective gap in consciousness between your being put to sleep and a new person waking up after this transformation. The new person's experiences follow directly yours. Now, let's just go over this again. In the original, in the mild transformation, I wake up as slightly transformed, and I think we can agree that it's just like my going to sleep. It's just like when I wake up, I'm slightly different. And there's been no subjective gap. Now, what I'm suggesting is that if you make further changes in me so that I end up as a new person, we still should not suppose that for me, I go into nothingness and a new person comes out of nothingness. Rather, we have a continuous, instantaneous following on of one experience from the other. So what I want to say is, if there are no this is the point I just made, if there are no subjective gaps between you and the somewhat altered you, why should there be any gaps between you and the resulting new person? That's the claim. So if you get the idea of there being no subjective gaps for you in regular life and then being slightly transformed, I think you should agree that once you're transformed into someone who isn't you any longer, you shouldn't suppose that there's going to be a subjective gap, because that additional change isn't something that would interrupt consciousness. So, but this is the part that you might get hung up on. But I think it's plausible. So here it is. Consciousness has been transformed. It has a different personal context, but consciousness is continuous across the transformation for the subjects involved. And the way we could express it is this. When I go, I'm always present in my life. I'm never absent. For the person who wakes up, they haven't experienced not being there. They wake up with their, say, new memories, their new personality. For them, they've always been there. And I want to say that the transformation, seeing how this works, should make it clear that there's no nothingness in which I, as a person, fall into when I cease to exist. And there's no nothingness out of which the new person that's the result of the transformation comes out of. So this is the thought experiment. And it depends, what it depends on is buying, first of all, that there are no subjective gaps in ordinary life, no subjective gaps when you've been transformed a little bit, and then no subjective gaps when you've been transformed a lot. Okay? So, here's the third step. Think about radical changes in yourself, in the time and location. This is the far end of the spectrum of transformation. Imagine that you're put to sleep. The neurosurgeons make tremendous changes, so you're no longer. They make changes in your body, change your body plan, perhaps. They can do. These are very competent surgeons, say of the 25th century. They can make you into anything they want. The important thing, though, is, given this radical transformation, you still have someone who is the result of this transformation, who wakes up perhaps centuries from now in a galaxy far, far away. But there's still no subjective gap. There's still the experience you have when you're put to sleep, and then your continuer, the person that you've been transformed, or the creature you've been transformed into, has their first experience upon awakening, and there's been no nothingness, no black abyss of emptiness into which you've fallen, and out of which the new creature or person has arisen. So what I want to suggest is, even in this situation, where you're say, put to sleep for centuries and end up moved geographically far, far away and end up transformed radically, there's still no reason to think that consciousness isn't continuous between you and resulting whatever it is. I know this is getting increasingly hard to swallow, and that's fine. But what I want to say is that consciousness, again, is continuous across transformations in its personal context. And what I want to call this is generic subjective continuity. In other words, there's nothing in common between me and the thing that I've been transformed into, except what? The presence of consciousness for each of us. That's what's continuous. There's been no gap or emptiness or nothingness into which that I've experienced, or out of which this new creature comes. And this kind of continuity I would call generic. Generic because there's no particular person involved, but it's something that each person shares, namely the experience of being present, of being in the world, Having a conscious perspective on the world, that's what's in common. And that's why I would call it generic subjective. It's subjective because it has to do with consciousness. And it's continuous because we shouldn't expect there to be a gap. So radical transformation ends you, the person, so you've died, but consciousness continues. So the subject is still present for itself. There's no subjective gap or nothingness into which you have fallen. So this thought experiment is mainly designed to get you to sort of feel intuitively that the very idea of nothingness or blackness or emptiness is just not an option for you. So, finally, what to expect at death? Well, normal death and birth, what each of us will undergo, is a natural extreme case of radical transformation and generic subjective continuity. That's what I want to claim about normal birth and death. It's a transformation. It's just what? There's no continuer. There's no someone that you've been transformed into. It's just you die, and then all the rest of the subjects that come into being exist. What death is not, it's not the end of experience. And the thought experiment is meant to get you to see that. Death, instead, is the radical refreshment of consciousness. There's no personal subjective continuity after death. As I said at the beginning, death is the end of you. It's the end of all of us. There's nothing carried over, so there's nothing spooky or woo about this. It's completely naturalistic. What it depends on is looking at consciousness itself. Don't anticipate nothingness, rather anticipate somethingness, which is generic subjective continuity. Now, you don't know what it's going to be, and that's kind of the cool thing about death. We cannot know what the next moment is going to be, but we can kind of guess. Consciousness is to exist as a point of view on the world, taking in and modeling.
I often get the criticism that atheists and other secular people, naturalists, etc., do not actually believe in a black void after death. And I'm misrepresenting what they're actually saying, and they are actually just being poetic. But I conclude that if they have not come to the conclusion of what is called generic subjective continuity, then they must believe in some sort of black void or some kind of endless blankness, because they have yet to come to the realization of what ceasing to exist would entail. So the mind cannot help but trying to fill in that void of knowledge. And so that void of knowledge is filled with the concept of a black void. And here's an example of that.
It's the way our brains work. We can't conceive not existing. And so technically we're like, okay, well, my brain legitimately cannot conceive of this concept. So in my head, even me, when I think about non-existing, I picture myself in a dark place.
Notice how she said, even me. So she's suggesting that others believe in this. She has concluded the same thing that I have concluded, that because of our lack of knowledge, that we come to this vision of a void, as she does. But she knows that that's not the case, but she claims that it's not possible for us to conceptualize non-existence.
It's the way our brains work. We can't conceive not existing. And
so, like I said, people believe in this nothingness. People don't just arbitrarily choose words whenever they're writing a poem to convey their what they want to convey. And the same goes for their belief of what happens after death. They don't choose words like black void and endless silence and peaceful oblivion, etc., arbitrarily. They don't throw a dart at a dictionary in whatever word. They specifically choose these words because it is conveying what they want to convey, what they envision, what their lack of ability to conclude what actually happens causes them to arrive at. They might know that they're not getting it right, but yet their brain is, because they have not yet concluded generic subjective continuity. And they don't even need to call it by that name. When they arrive at that conclusion, they'll be able to explain it in some way, or they will have a very difficult time explaining it, but they will realize yet another life will follow this one, because the last time I didn't exist, a life followed that non-existence. And I use the word non-existence as a kind of a stand-in word because people understand what I mean by non-existence. The last time you didn't exist was followed by a life, due to a life being born. I use the word a life, the phrase a life, to see lives in the most objective sense. Just a life. That's what you are, is a life. If you strip away everything that makes you unique, your name, your individual behaviors, etc., that's all you are, is just a life, just another life. My cat is another life. You, me, everyone you know, every animal on planet Earth is just a life. And so each of them is, each brain is responsible for consciousness. So now I'll get on to other examples of this idea of nothingness after death, this nothingness delusion.
Not at all.
Do you think you go somewhere?
No.
The one thing I can't understand, I can't grasp my mind around, I feel when you die, there's just nothing. It's like when you're asleep and you're not dreaming. But I can't imagine nothingness lasting forever. That's the thing that I cannot get.
I can't grasp. To not exist forever.
Forever.
When does forever end?
Yeah.
Are you afraid of dying?
Yet another example.
Planning process, and the moment of longing rarely lasts. It makes little sense. One moment of freedom for an eternity of nothing, of permanent silence. Is this a worthy sacrifice?
So, sorry about that. Yet another idea of an eternity of silence. A conclusion made by either completely believing that there will literally be an endless silence after death, or a lack of ability to actually come to the conclusion of generic subjective continuity. So it doesn't, either way, it doesn't really matter if they are being poetic or not. They're not coming to the conclusion and putting it into words is what's important here, is why I am so adamant at spreading the idea of generic subjective continuity, because this conclusion needs to be heard and talked about. And it's surprising that, Sam Harris discussed it on a podcast and it didn't blow up. It should have, because it's such a radical idea compared to free will and determinism. I think that this generic subjective continuity should be the main topic on the table.
However, I submit to you that not only is this fate likely, but preferable to any infinite existence somehow experiencing and perceiving away from your body and brain that allows this. Oblivion, to me anyway, provides a finality and permanence that heavily puts our lives into perspective. This eventual and equal equilibrium of nothingness should not be a fate that inspires dread, but actually should be. And the likelihood that on brain death, we too, at least our conscious and thinking us, or the I within us, ceases to be, and I actually feel pretty damn lucky. Please watch my video, by the way, on eternal oblivion as well, and why I think it's, thankfully, most likely to be true, to fully grasp where I'm coming from here. That I am finite is actually not only, dare I say it, a blessing, when considering the alternative.
Accept death as an essential part of life. Doing things the second time around is almost always less intimidating than the first. So if we consider the idea that we have already experienced what it means to be dead and come to terms with the fact that we will experience it again and be totally and utterly okay, then death becomes easier to face, easier to reduce our fear and apprehension towards.
Here on a recent video by Matt Dillahunty, where he discusses the hope for a supernatural afterlife, I explain generic subjective continuity and why, if it's true, it's not exactly a good thing. And this realization makes me actually hope that there is some sort of good afterlife. So I'll read that now. I actually hope there is some sort of good afterlife, because the alternative, ceasing to exist, would mean that the same thing that followed the last time I didn't exist would happen again. A life. Somewhere in the universe. Notice that I said a life and not my life. This will happen because there will be lives after I die. Lives are constantly being born here on Earth, and most likely elsewhere in the universe. So just as it was a life coming to exist that caused a life to follow non-existence, so too will a life coming to exist cause a life to once again follow non-existence. Doesn't sound good to me. How can anyone read these and deny that these people really do believe that not existing is peaceful? Again, we don't choose words arbitrarily. We choose words that best convey what we want to convey. But again, what really matters is that most people are not coming to the conclusion of what's called generic subjective continuity. This is why I make this content. I like to see GSC discussed as much as free will and determinism are currently discussed. Okay, so here's the thought experiment on death, generic subjective continuity. So imagine you're here at Arches National Park and you're standing there looking at the arch, and well, then suddenly everyone dies. Everyone in the universe dies, including you. There are no more consciousnesses whatsoever anywhere. And so a lot of people imagine that after you die, it'll be all black. You'll just see this empty black void. There'll be no sound or anything, no thoughts or anything like that. And this is actually nonsensical, because what would happen, well, let's see what would actually happen if generic subjective continuity is true, and if you actually did cease to exist. So here we are again. You didn't die yet, but let's imagine that you do die. But then after you die, let's say some period of time after you die, that some other single living organism, a sentient organism, comes to exist somewhere in the universe. So instead of it being a black void after you die, what it would be is, well, let's see. So you die, you cease to exist, and then instead of it being a black void, it is something more akin to a camera switch on a movie set, because there are no other perspectives anywhere else in the universe except for this one. So this is the only experience that is occurring now. Instead of you in a black void or you being anywhere, you're completely gone. So the only experience that is occurring after you've ceased to exist is the one and only experience that does exist. It is the only experience there is. And so it is, like I said, it's this experience of this organism that came to exist after you died, rather than it being you in a black void, because you're completely gone. So the only experience that is going on is the experience here on this other planet, who knows where it's at, billions of light years away, or maybe even in another parallel universe somewhere. But so that's what would be going on, as opposed to being in a black void. So if you died, you're here, you're alive, and everyone dies, including you, it would not be a black void. Instead, if you died and then someone else eventually came to exist somewhere else in the universe, because that would be the only experience there is occurring at that point in time after you've died, it would be that consciousness, that experience of being a living organism in the universe, as opposed to you in a black void. So it's pretty much the same thing that happened last time you didn't exist. It was just, it was followed by birth, but it would be followed by yet another onset of consciousness again, only somewhere else, and it would be something else. It wouldn't be a continuation of you. So, and this isn't supposed to be comforting, really. It's just, I'm stating this as a matter of fact. So it's not a personal continuity of your consciousness. It's just that there will be consciousness in the universe after you die, and because you no longer exist, and that is the only experience there is in this thought experiment, so that will be the experience that comes after your death, as opposed to you experiencing nothingness. So I hope that helps explain generic subjective continuity. So look, we can do this in reverse. Say this one and only alien organism dies, and then you come to exist, and you're the only consciousness there is whatsoever. And so, you have to look at yourself as just another consciousness. Sam Harris recently said that we are identical to experience. You're not having an experience, you are experience. And so, wherever there's experience, if there's only one experience in the universe, whether it is the body that's watching this video right now or some other body, if there's only one experience in the universe, then that's the experience. That is going to be the experience, the one and only experience that's going on, as opposed to you being in a black void.